The room was quiet except for the hum of machines. It was always quiet in the monitoring station. That was the point. Noise meant distraction. Distraction meant missed signals. And missed signals, as the orientation manual put it in plain language, meant extinction. Yara Osei had read that manual 7 years ago. She still kept her coffee on the left side of the desk, so her right hand stayed free for the keyboard. The station sat in low orbit above Earth, staffed by 12 people at any given time, officially listed under the UN's Department of Space Infrastructure. The name was boring on purpose. No one looked twice at infrastructure departments. That, too, was the point. Yara was 29 years old. She had a degree in signal analysis and a second degree in dead languages. Most people thought the second degree was strange. Her supervisor had hired her specifically because of it. She was on hour 6 of her shift when the signal came in. It didn't announce itself. Nothing ever did. One moment, the frequency band was dead static, the kind of static that had a texture to it after you'd listened long enough, like white noise with a shape, and then there was something else in it. A structure. A pattern underneath the pattern. Yara leaned forward. She pulled the signal into the isolation filter and let the analysis software begin its work. The software was old. Older than the station. Older than most of the people who had ever worked here. It had been built by a team in the 2030s, updated 17 times, and it had a name that no one used anymore because the woman who named it had been dead for 60 years. The software took 38 seconds. Yara read the result. She read it again. Then she picked up her coffee, drank what was left of it, set the mug down, and opened a new message window. The subject line she typed was, "It's them. Initiating protocol quorum. Get some sleep. People, tomorrow's a long day." She attached the decryption file, flagged the message at priority level 6, the highest level that existed, the one that woke people up at 3 a.m., and sent it. Then she opened a second window and began writing the operational report. The signal had come from a fleet, a large one. The analysis software put the transmission source at roughly 4 light hours out, which meant the fleet itself was close enough that the light from their engines would be visible to the right telescope within 48 hours. They had been traveling toward Earth for a long time, moving carefully, quietly, the way something moves when it has done this before and knows that the first few hours after broadcast are the most interesting ones. The signal itself was not complicated. That was the thing about the Verith Dominion, and yes, the translation confirmed it was them. The signature frequency markers matched the archived samples. Every single one. They were not complicated. They had no reason to be. The message said, in language that had been reconstructed and reverse translated through 4 dead civilizations, before a human linguist finally cracked the base grammar in 2019. You have been selected for integration into the Dominion. Resistance is noted as common and is factored into our timeline. You have 72 hours. That was it. No terms. No conditions. No names. Just a countdown, dressed up in diplomatic language. Yara typed it all into the report. She included the timestamp, the frequency band, the fleet position estimate, and a note at the bottom that said, "Signal structure matches 2031. Kareth Archive Fragment. Appendix D, pages 114 through 118. No deviations. They have not changed the format in 400 years." She saved the report. The countdown timer on the wall above her monitor, a plain digital display, black numbers on white background, nothing dramatic about it, read 71 hours, 59 minutes, and 12 seconds. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got up, walked to the small kitchen at the back of the station, and made herself another cup of tea. In 2031, a research vessel had found the Kareth archive. The Kareth were gone, had been gone for a long time. What was left of their civilization existed only in a debris field beyond what used to be their home system. Broken structures, dead satellites, and one deep storage data archive that had been built into the core of an asteroid and sealed so thoroughly that it had survived everything else. It took 9 years to open it. It took another 20 to understand most of it. What the archive contained was the record of a civilization that had seen something coming and had tried, in the time they had left, to document everything they knew. Species, technologies, warnings, and one recurring signal repeated across dozens of files. Always the same base structure, always the same frequency signature that the Karath had labeled in their own language, with a word that translated roughly as, "the last thing you hear." The humans who read that label had not panicked. They had made photocopies, metaphorically speaking, and sent them to every relevant department. The signal analysis team got a copy. The linguistics team got a copy. The military strategy division got a copy. The Civil Infrastructure Bureau got a copy. The UN Security Council got a copy. And a small, quiet sub-department with a budget line buried inside a municipal infrastructure allocation. A department with no public profile, no press releases, and a 12-digit file catalog that went back to 2031, got a copy, and began doing what it did. Filing. Cross-referencing. Preparing. Yara had joined that sub-department 7 years ago. She had never once thought her job was boring, even when it was, because boring meant the timer was still running and the work was still good. Boring was the sound of something functioning the way it should. She stood in the kitchen and waited for the kettle. Down in the operations center, 2 floors below a larger room, more people, more screens, the lights were coming on one by one. Not in a dramatic way. The way lights come on in an office building at 7 a.m. People walking in, sitting down, opening files that had been pre-positioned for exactly this moment. Nobody was screaming. A man named Harlow, who ran overnight logistics coordination, came in with a box of granola bars and put them on the shared table because he'd done this drill enough times to know people forgot to eat. He pulled up his console, confirmed the fleet position estimate, and began running the distribution check on shelter rotation assignments. This was not his first protocol quorum alert. It was his third. The first 2 had been false positives, not errors, exactly. More like fragments, pieces of signals that had the right shape but weren't the real thing. Each time, the department had treated it as real until proven otherwise. Each time, the machinery had spun up, checked itself, and spun back down. Each time, they got faster. Harlow ate a granola bar and confirmed the first batch of assignments. Yara came back to her desk with her tea. She sat down, pulled up the secondary monitoring feed, and went back to work. Outside the station's windows, the stars looked the same as they always did. Cold, distant, indifferent. Somewhere in that darkness, 4 light hours away, a fleet was moving toward a planet it intended to take apart. The fleet did not know it had been expected. It did not know that the signal it sent had an ancestor. That the ancestor had been found in a dead civilization's last breath. That the species now receiving it had spent 400 years, not 400 years of scrambling, not 400 years of hoping, but 400 years of times filing and cross-referencing and preparing times building the answer. The countdown timer read 71 hours, 47 minutes, and 3 seconds. Yara sipped her tea. She had a report to finish. Fleet Admiral Sorak did not believe in doubt. Doubt was a thing that happened to other species. Species that had not stood where he stood, which was at the front of a war room that smelled like recycled air and victory, looking at a star map that had 17 dots on it. 17 dots. Each one a system. Each one a civilization that had, at some point in the last 2 centuries, received the same signal he had just sent to the blue-green world, now visible on the main screen. 17 dots. 17 civilizations. 17 integrations. He had personally overseen 4 of them. The rest were in the records. He had read every file. He knew the timelines by heart not because he was required to, but because they comforted him. The numbers were consistent. The pattern never changed. And a pattern that never changed was not a pattern. It was a law. He turned to his lead strategist, a pale, thin officer named Vel, and said, "Begin the pre-descent briefing. Standard formation. I want assault wings staged by hour 60. Vel nodded and began. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Vel was thorough. He always was. He laid out the fleet disposition, the descent corridors, the atmospheric entry windows, and the projected resistance timeline in the flat, calm voice of a man who had done this enough times that the words had worn smooth. The other commanders listened. Some took notes. One, a young wing captain named Dorath, on his first integration watched the screen very carefully and said nothing. The methodology was not complicated because it did not need to be. Step 1. Send the broadcast. The broadcast did 3 things. It announced dominance. It started the clock. And it broke something in the receiving civilization that no military technology could break on its own, the belief that things would continue as they were. That belief, once broken, produced chaos. And chaos, reliably and without exception, produced the conditions that made descent easy. Step 2. Wait. Watch the communications spectrum for the panic frequency. Every species had one. The specific content was always different. Some screamed, some went silent, some burned their own infrastructure in the first 12 hours, but the frequency signature of civilizational panic was universal. It looked like fractured signal traffic, high volume, low coherence, overlapping channels, like a nervous system firing in every direction at once. Step 3. Enter the atmosphere during peak panic. At that point, the population was already doing the work for you. The infrastructure was compromised. The command structures were broken or breaking. The will to organize, to coordinate, to respond, that was the thing the broadcast really targeted, and it was gone by hour 48 in almost every recorded case. Hour 72 was simply cleanup. Vel finished the briefing. The commanders confirmed their assignments. Sorek looked at the blue-green world on the screen for a moment. Small, bright, unremarkable, and dismissed the room. What he did not say, because it did not need to be said, was that this species had been observed for some time. Observation was standard. The Dominion had long-range monitoring on dozens of developing civilizations across the quadrant. The humans had been on the list for roughly 80 years. The assessment files were updated every decade by a team who had, over those 80 years, noted the following. An industrial civilization, spacefaring at a low level, internally fractured along political and geographic lines, prone to large-scale conflicts with itself. That last point was usually a good sign. A species that spent its energy fighting itself had less to spend on anything else. It arrived at the integration point already tired, already fractured. The broadcast was almost a mercy in those cases. It gave them a common enemy to focus on right before they lost the ability to focus on anything. The file on humans had an addendum from 12 years ago, flagged by a junior analyst, which noted an uptick in certain kinds of signal traffic encrypted, patterned, unusually coherent for a species this early in its development. The analyst had recommended a closer look. The recommendation had been reviewed, noted, and filed. It had not been followed up on. Sorek did not know this. It was not the kind of thing that reached Fleet Admiral level. Details like that lived in the middle of the bureaucracy, in the thick layer between the people who gathered information and the people who acted on it. In that layer, things sometimes moved slowly. Sometimes they stopped moving altogether. On Earth, in a building that had no sign on the door, Colonel General Adaiz Moro sat at a desk that was covered in a controlled kind of mess paper, tablets, a coffee mug with something dark and cold at the bottom, and read the protocol quorum alert. She read the whole thing, every line, even the parts she already knew. Then she read Yara's addendum. Signal structure matches 2031. Kareth Archive Fragment. Appendix D. Pages 114 through 118. No deviations. Morrow set the tablet down. She said, to nobody in particular, same formation as the Keth Purge. These people never read their own history. She picked up the tablet again. Good. She was 58 years old. She was not tall. She was not physically impressive in any way that a stranger would notice. She had a way of standing that made her look like she was part of whatever room she was in, like a structural feature that had always been there. Her staff called her the Wall, not to her face, and not as an insult. She began signing the logistics approvals that had been pre-staged for this moment. There were a lot of them. Each one moved something: resources, personnel, systems, into a position that had been planned years ago, updated 6 months ago, drilled twice in the last year. Her hand moved steadily across the tablet. She did not rush. Rushing was for situations you hadn't prepared for. 60 kilometers away, in a secondary school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and old sneakers, a 15-year-old named Fen was running a civil defense drill. She had done this 4 times in the last year. She knew the sequence by heart. Shelter assignments first, communications check second, medical triage stations third. She had a clipboard. She moved through the gymnasium, calling out positions to her group, with the flat authority of someone who had been told, clearly and early, that the drill mattered. Her teacher, supervising from the back of the room, watched her work and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The girl had it. When the drill was done, Fen sat down on the bleachers and looked at her checklist. Everything was correct. Everything was in order. She made a small mark at the bottom of the page, her own notation, not part of the official checklist, and moved on. Back in the monitoring station, the signal from the Verith fleet continued to arrive. It was still repeating. That was part of the protocol. The broadcast looped every 6 hours to ensure no civilization missed it. A second analyst had arrived for the shift change and sat down next to Yara. "Is it confirmed?" the analyst asked. "It's confirmed," Yara said. The analyst looked at the countdown timer. "How are you this calm?" Yara looked at the timer too. Then at the long row of archived signal files on her secondary screen, 400 years of fragments and pieces and dead civilizations and slow, patient work. The record of everything that had been built, so that this moment, when it came, was not the beginning of something. It was the end of a very long preparation. "I'm calm," she said, "because someone else did the hard part already." She turned back to her console. The countdown read 68 hours, 12 minutes, and 44 seconds. In the war room of the Verith fleet, Vel was updating the descent formation. Standard. Clean. Exactly as it had always been. No deviations. The attack began at 4:17 inches the morning, Earth Standard Time. Not because the Verith had chosen that hour for any particular reason. It was simply where the countdown landed when you worked backward from fleet position, atmospheric entry angles, and optimal descent windows. The math pointed to early morning. It always did. Early morning was when defenses were thinnest, when command structures ran on skeleton crews, when the world was at its least coherent. At least, that was the theory. At 4:16, the monitoring station registered the fleet-breaking formation and beginning its descent approach. Yara had been at her desk for 22 hours by then, sleeping in short rotations in the back room, eating from the bag of food someone had left on the kitchen counter 2 days ago. She saw the formation change register on her screen. She sent one message. It said, "Clock's running. Everybody's ready. Here we go." At 4:17, every sensor array pointed at the approaching fleet lit up at once. For 40 seconds, it looked like the end of the world. The sky readings spiked. The atmospheric monitors registered approach vectors on a scale that turned the display bars red. The communications spectrum, every channel, every band flooded with traffic. High volume, fractured, overlapping. The exact frequency signature of civilizational panic. It looked, to every instrument the Verith had pointed at the planet, like what they expected to see. Sorak stood at his command station and watched the readings pour in. The panic spectrum was running exactly as projected. The communication infrastructure appeared to be breaking down. He could see the fractured signal traffic layered, chaotic, falling over itself. The humans were doing what every species did. They were screaming. He allowed himself one small moment of confirmation. This was the part he had never tired of. Not the violence, which was minimal in the good integrations, but this moment. The moment the species discovered that the thing they had feared without fully believing would actually happen was, in fact, happening. The moment the abstract became real. He said to Vel, "Descent wings begin." The wings began. What Sorak did not know what his instruments were not built to find, because no one had ever built instruments to find it, was that the panic frequency they were reading was a recording. Not a precise recording. It was generated in real time, procedurally, by a system that had been designed 30 years ago by a team of signal engineers, whose job description said times, infrastructure maintenance times, and whose actual job was something else entirely. The system read the expected Verith sensor profile, calculated what a panicking civilization's communication spectrum should look like to that specific sensor configuration, and produced it. Live. Continuously. On every band, the Verath were monitoring. Underneath it, running on frequencies the Verath sensors weren't tuned to detect because why would they be? The actual human communications network was clean and cold and completely organized. Military traffic. Logistics, confirmations. Position checks. The kind of signal pattern that, if you knew what you were looking at, sounded less like a species under attack and more like a very large machine running a very rehearsed sequence, which was exactly what it was. In the descent corridors, the approach vectors the Verath had mapped from the Karath archive data, the same data humanity had also found and spent decades studying the assault wings, began their run. The corridors had been mapped carefully. The Verath were thorough. They had identified the angles that minimized atmospheric resistance, the windows that reduced detection risk, the paths that put them above population centers in the shortest time. They had mapped those corridors from the same source humans had, and humans had spent 30 years putting things in those corridors. Not weapons primarily. The weapons were there, but they were not the first layer. The first layer was simpler. The descent corridors had been seeded with what looked, to Verath sensors, like debris-dead satellites, small rocks, junk, the natural accumulation of a messy, industrializing civilization that didn't clean up after itself. Except it wasn't debris. It was positioned, every piece of it, placed by unmanned vehicles over the course of a decade and a half, placed so carefully and slowly that it never registered as a pattern, because the individual placements were years apart, and nobody's surveillance system flags something as a threat when it just sits there for 4 years, doing nothing. It sat there for 4 years doing nothing. It had been doing nothing for exactly the right amount of time. The sensor operator's name was Orath. He was 23 years old, and on his first real integration. He had studied the briefing files carefully. He had been told what to expect, and he had believed it, and he had no reason not to because everything in his training pointed in the same direction. He was watching his descent corridor feed when the numbers started to look wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Subtly wrong. The kind of wrong that lives at the edge of what you notice, that makes you check your instruments not because you're alarmed, but because something small in the back of your head is trying to get your attention. He checked his instruments. They were fine. He checked them again. Still fine. He was about to flag it to his supervisor when the first descent wing hit the corridor's first position marker, a spot where, according to the approach map, there was nothing notable, and the debris field activated. Not exploded. Activated. The pieces moved. Oriented. Became, in a span of about 4 seconds, something that was very clearly not debris. Orath stared at his screen. He opened his mouth. He said, "I think they knew where we were coming." Morrow was in the operations center when the corridor engagement began. She watched the display. The wings hit the first layer. The second layer closed behind them, not aggressively. No dramatic pincer movement, just a quiet sealing of the exit angle, the way you close a door. The third layer was already positioning. She drank her coffee. The coffee was bad. It had been sitting too long. She drank it anyway, because she had been awake for a long time, and the taste was not the point. On the screen, the engagement looked nothing like a battle. It looked like a mechanism working, like watching the inside of a clock. Each piece moving in sequence, not because it was reacting to the piece before it, but because it had always been going to move at that moment. Because it had been built to move at that moment. 400 years of looking at a dead civilization's warning, of saying, quietly, in buildings with no signs on the doors, when they will come this way. Of building the answer not in a rush, not in a panic, but in the slow and patient way that you build something you want to last. The wings were not destroyed. That had been an explicit choice in the doctrine: damage the capacity to fight, not the capacity to talk. The Verath fleet was still functional, still crewed, still capable of receiving a communication. Morrow set down her coffee. "Open a channel," she said. "Let's see if they want to discuss their options." In the Verath war room, every screen was showing something that had no category. Sorak looked at the corridor feeds, at the seated positions, at the layered response pattern, that was clearly not improvised. He looked at the panic frequency, still broadcasting from the planet below, still generating, still perfectly calibrated to his sensors, and understood, in the span of a few seconds, that he had been watching a performance, that the chaos was a costume, that underneath it, something had been standing very still, for a very long time, waiting for this exact moment. He did not say anything. He did not, for the first time in his career, know what to say. The channel request from the planet came through a moment later. Clean signal. No distortion. The kind of transmission you send when you are not in a hurry. Vel looked at him. Sorak nodded. The channel opened. And on the screen, sitting at a desk covered in a controlled kind of mess, holding a mug of bad coffee, looking for all the world like someone who had been expecting this call, was a woman who did not look angry, did not look triumphant, did not look afraid. She just looked like someone with options. Morrow had done this part before, in simulations. Hundreds of simulations. Different parameters each time, different fleet sizes, different approach patterns, different response postures from the other side. The simulation team had tried every version of this conversation they could think of. Sorak, of course, had not been in the simulations. But his type had. She had sat across from his type, or the model of it, so many times, that the real version felt familiar in the way that a test feels familiar, when you have already taken it several times, and know where the hard questions are. She looked at him on the screen. He was not what she'd expected, in the narrow sense taller, the crest on his head more elaborate than the archive photograph suggested. But in every meaningful sense, he was exactly what she'd expected. The posture of a person who had never been told no. The slight stillness that happens when a brain tries to process something it has no folder for. She let him look at her for a moment. She drank from the mug. Then she said, "Good morning. I have 3 options for you. I'll walk through them in order. Option 1 was the simplest. Full withdrawal of the fleet to a distance of no less than 8 light hours from Earth. Release of all archived integration data from previous Dominion operations, specifically the records of the 17 civilizations in their catalog. Formal acknowledgement, in writing, of Earth's sovereignty. In exchange, the fleet left intact. All crew returned unharmed. No pursuit." She said it the way you read a menu. Option 2 was more complicated, and she spent more time on it, because it involved several parties beyond just the fleet, currently in the engagement corridor. It involved the broader Dominion apparatus, and it came with a timeline and a verification structure and a monitoring arrangement that she described in clear and thorough language. She had notes, but she didn't look at them. Then she said, "Option 3. She paused. Not for drama. To make sure she had his attention. Option 3 is the one I don't need to explain in detail. You've seen what the corridors looked like. You know the approach vectors you used, because you chose them. You understand that if we built what we built there, we built it elsewhere too. Option 3 is what happens if you require a demonstration of that. I would prefer not to demonstrate it. The cleanup is time-consuming." She said that last sentence the way someone says the weather is cold. A plain fact. She set down her mug. "I would go with option 1. The food is better." Sorak said nothing for a long moment. This was not hesitation. Exactly. It was something closer to recalibration. The slow work of taking a mental architecture that had been built over decades and checking it against a reality that did not fit. Every integration in the Dominion's history had followed the same structure. Broadcast, panic, descent, collapse. The species on the other end had always been reacting, had always been behind the clock. This one had been ahead of it. He looked at the engagement data on his secondary screen. The corridor positions, the debris that was not debris, the panic frequency that had been performing rather than expressing. He ran the logic backward. When had they known? How far back did this go? And the answer kept landing somewhere so early that it felt wrong. It was not wrong. He knew it was not wrong. He said, "You knew about us," Morrow said. "We knew about the signal. We found it in another civilization's records. They left very good documentation." She paused. It was the last thing they did. Sorak understood what she was saying. He had read the Karath file. Every fleet admiral had, He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "How long have you been preparing?" "Since 2031, she said. "When we found the archive. That is, 400 years, roughly. In human terms. Less in yours, I imagine, but the math is close enough." He was quiet again. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was, at this point, a professional skill. What Sorak was trying to find, and could not, was a frame for what he was looking at. Every species the Dominion had been integrated, because the encounter found them at the wrong moment, mid-development, mid-conflict, fractured enough that a unified response was impossible, and disbelieving enough that the 72 hours were gone before they were fully real. What he was looking at was a species that had not been caught at the wrong moment. Had, apparently, worked carefully to ensure it would never be caught at the wrong moment. That had found a warning in a dead civilization's ashes, and instead of grieving or ignoring or adding it to a history text, had built an entire response apparatus around it. Over 400 years. Without breaking the secret, without the preparation becoming political, becoming fractured, becoming the kind of thing that gets abandoned when one generation passes and the next one loses faith in a threat it has never personally seen. That was the part he could not hold. The sustained belief, the willingness to work toward a danger that was always one generation away from becoming a story, and then a legend, and then a myth. How did they keep it real? He thought of the monitoring station, the signal analyst who had received the broadcast and sent a calm email, the operations center that had spun up without screaming. The woman on the screen who was eating lunch, he noticed now she had a sandwich next to the mug like this was a scheduled meeting. It had been a scheduled meeting. He said, "You trusted each other." It was not what he meant to say. It came out wrong. Or maybe it came out right. Morrow looked at him and said, simply, "We trusted the work." Vel, standing just outside the camera's field of view, was watching Sorak. He had worked under Sorak for 11 years. He had seen him in 17 integration operations and 4 contested situations that had required actual force. He had never seen him look the way he looked right now. Not defeated. Not angry. Lost. The kind of loss that happens when a map that has always worked stops corresponding to the landscape. When every trained instinct fires and finds nothing to grip. Vel thought about the junior analyst's recommendation, 12 years ago, that they take a closer look at human signal traffic. He thought about the note that said the traffic was unusually coherent for a species this early in its development. He thought about the word times filed. He looked at the woman on the screen, who had finished her sandwich and was writing something down, and thought, 12 years. They had had 12 years to notice. They had filed it. Morrow finished writing, capped her pen, and looked back at the screen. "I need an answer within 4 hours," she said. "That's not a deadline for drama. It's a logistics window. We have a rotation to manage, and I'd like to confirm the timeline before the next shift briefing." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has no personal animosity in the room. "You came here because your record said this would work," she said. "Your record is good. It worked 17 times. I'm not going to tell you that was wrong of you. You were operating on the best data you had." She paused. "We had better data." She clicked off the screen. The channel stayed open on her end, recording. She picked up her pen and went back to the logistics approvals. There were still a lot of them. She did not rush. Sorak chose option 1. He sent the confirmation through the official channel, with full formal language and a documentation stamp. He did it 3 hours and 41 minutes after Morrow closed the screen, 19 minutes before the window closed. Vel watched him do it and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The fleet began its withdrawal at 0800 hours, Earth Standard Time. It took 11 hours to reach the required distance. The monitoring station tracked every step of it. Yara watched the formation pull back on her display, the fleet moving slowly away from the planet the way something moves when it understands it has no better options. Not fast, not panicked, just deliberate and finished. She made a note in the operational log. When the fleet reached distance, she updated the file. The file that had been opened in 2031 and had never, in all those years, sat empty. She typed the entry in plain language. Verath Dominion Fleet. Approach confirmed. Protocol quorum engaged. Withdrawal confirmed. No casualties. No infrastructure damage. She added the timestamp. She saved the file. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and made herself the first meal she had eaten sitting down in 36 hours. The Galactic community noticed. They noticed the way things are noticed at great distance, slowly, incompletely, with the specific confusion of people who have a framework for how things work and have just seen something that doesn't fit into it. The Dominion had integrated 17 civilizations. The record was known. The pattern was known. Species at the receiving end of the broadcast had options very few. All bad. That was also known. It was the kind of known that becomes background, becomes assumption, becomes the water you swim in without thinking about it. A species that had received the broadcast and then sent the fleet home had not happened before. The first responses to come in were cautious. A dozen monitoring bodies sent standard inquiry messages to the human communications infrastructure. Polite, careful, the diplomatic equivalent of someone knocking on a door they're not sure is safe to knock on. The messages asked, in various formal constructions, what had happened. Humanity sent a reply. It was not long. It was written in the 17 base languages most commonly used in the inhabited systems, all of which humanity had been studying since 2031, which nobody had known, and it said, clearly and without embellishment, what had happened. The Verith fleet had come. The response architecture had engaged. The fleet had accepted option 1 and withdrawn. Then the reply included a second section. The second section was the archive. Not the Kareth archive itself that was enormous, and much of it was still being translated, but a summary, a structured record of what had been found and what had been built because of it. The signal signature, the approach methodologies, the descent corridor patterns, the panic frequency profile, and how to generate a counter-performance layer, the fleet formation structures, the timeline methodology, how the 72 hours were meant to be used, and how to use them differently. All of it, free, attached to the reply, documented in plain language that a signal analyst at any level of development could follow. The reasoning was simple, and Morrow had articulated it in the internal debrief that morning with the flat matter-of-factness that was her default register. The information was only powerful as a surprise. The Dominion now knew the surprise was gone, which meant the archive's value was no longer in keeping it, it was in sharing it. If the Verith come back, she said, standing at the front of the room with bad coffee and a posture that suggested the wall itself had opinions. They come back knowing we're ready. If they go somewhere else, we'd rather that somewhere else was ready too. She paused. We had this information for 400 years. We were the only ones who could use it. That worked for us. It is not, as a general model, how I would like the galaxy to operate. She sat down. The debrief continued. The responses to the archive came in waves. The first wave was disbelief. Not of the content, the documentation was too thorough, too specific to dismiss, but of the decision to release it. There were civilizations out there that had spent their own generations quietly accumulating advantages, and the concept of handing the advantage to everyone else was not intuitive. Several messages came in asking if the archive was complete, meaning, had anything been held back? Humanity sent back a one-line answer. It's complete. We held back the bad coffee recipe. The second wave was something harder to name. Messages came in from species who had not been integrated, who had survived the Dominion's path by being too remote, or too small, or simply not noticed yet. And these messages had a different quality. They were not inquiries. They were not political. They were the kind of message that someone writes when they have been carrying something for a long time and have just been told that someone else noticed. A few of them said, in their own languages, "We thought we were alone in this." Humanity wrote back to each one individually. The Dominion released the integration records 2 months later. They did not do this voluntarily. The release was the result of the documentation verification process that had been part of Option 1, a clause that Morrow had included not because she expected the Dominion to honor it without pressure, but because having it in writing gave other parties standing to push. They pushed. The records came out. The records of 17 civilizations. Their names, their histories, what they had been, what had been done to them. For most of those species, The record in the Dominion's files was the only record that still existed anywhere. Everything else was gone. The galaxy read the records. The galaxy was quiet for a while. Fen found out about all of it the way most people did through the public release, which happened on a Thursday, which was a school day. She was sitting in class when the announcement came through. Her teacher paused the lesson. Put the summary on the main screen. Read through it in the same tone teachers use when they are deciding, in real time, how to feel about what they are saying. Fen read through it herself, on her own tablet, faster than her teacher. She already knew most of it. Not the details, those were classified at her clearance level, which was low, because she was 15. But the shape of it, the fact that something had been built over a very long time by a lot of people who did their work quietly and well. She had known that since the first civil defense drill she had done, at age 11, when the instructor had explained in simple, flat language why the drill mattered and what the drill was for. This is not a precaution, the instructor had said. This is a practice. There is a difference. A precaution is something you do because something might happen. A practice is something you do because you know how to do it, and you want to keep knowing. Fen had written that down. She still had the notebook. After class, her teacher asked the standard open question, "What do you want to study? What direction are you thinking?" The kind of question teachers ask in the aftermath of large events, partly because they're curious and partly because they want to see what lands. Fen thought about the drill, about the checklist, about the file her supervisor had mentioned once, briefly, in a tone that suggested it was old and important, a file that went all the way back, that had been updated by people who were long gone now, that had been kept going because someone decided it mattered, even when the threat felt distant. History, she said. Her teacher looked at her. We're good at it, Fen said. The file in the sub-department was updated one final time that week. Not by Yara, who was on leave for the first time in 3 years, sleeping in long, uninterrupted stretches and waking up to quiet mornings. Not by Harlow, who was already running analysis on the archive sharing program and building the next generation of the protocol framework. It was updated by a junior analyst named Pell, who had been in the department for 6 months, and who had been handed the file on her first week and told, keep it current. This is the most important file in the building. She had read it cover to cover. She had read it again. She had understood, somewhere in the second reading, that the file was not a record of victories. It was a record of attention, of a species that had found a warning in someone else's wreckage and had refused, generation after generation, to let it become background noise. Pell opened the file. She made the update. Status. Active. Monitoring. Ongoing. Notes. Archive. Distributed. Protocol quorum. Retired to historical record. New protocols under development. She scrolled to the bottom. At the very bottom of the file, in a section that had no official label, there was a running count. It had been there since the file was first created. Someone had started it, long ago, and every person who updated the file had kept it going. Species cataloged. One more, species that made it to round 2. Still just the one. Pell looked at that last line for a moment. She closed the file. She made herself coffee, not bad coffee. She had brought her own beans and sat down to begin the next thing. Outside, the morning was ordinary. Trains running. People going to work. The sky the same color. It had always been. Not dramatic, not significant. Just the sky, doing what the sky does. The file was 400 years old. It had never once been empty.